This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. This week we are going to be discussing the Mexican drug trade, its evolutions recently. Our very special guest is Benjamin Smith, Professor of Latin American History at the University of Warwick, also the author of The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. So I can think of no one more qualified than to discuss this subject with us than Ben today. So welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you. I mean, there's clearly somebody in a New York courtroom in a couple of weeks called Mayo Zambada, but you've got me instead. Sorry.
Well, I think I wonder how willing El Mayo would be to discuss with us some of the geopolitical consequences of his capture. And of course, the recent violence taking place. Let's jump right in. Now, there is a. I think we should just take that with that reference. El Mayo being captured and the feeling of betrayal by Los Chapitos. What is going on right now?
So there's been a kind of unspoken. There have been problems between the Sinaloa Cartel, I'm sure many of your listeners will know, is not really a kind of cartel in any meaningful sense of the word. It's a series of clans or family organizations, occasionally team together to do drug trades and occasionally don't. There have been tensions between different groups at different times over the last 20 or 30 years. Perhaps the most bloody of these disagreements was between Chapo and his cousins, the Beltran-Leyvas, which exploded into a pretty brutal civil war from about 2008 to 2011-12, and did really kind of engulf most of Mexico, cause a lot of the bloodshed. We're worried now because it looks like there has been a division between one group, which are the kids of El Chapo, kids of Joaquin Guzman Loera, and the other kind of main chief of the Sinaloa Cartel, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. And as many of your listeners will know, Mayo Zambada turned up in an El Paso airport in a plane with one of El Chapo's sons. He claimed that he was kidnapped. And now, although there have been differing versions about this, it looks pretty clear that probably was the case. There's whole layers of lies and government obfuscation, and clearly the US authorities aren't telling the whole truth, and clearly the Mexican authorities are not telling the whole truth. I mean, one of the most extraordinary parts of this entire story is that the Mexican government claimed that this is where you this is maybe an introduction to what's going on in Mexico. The head of the former head of the university was apparently the broker on a putative deal between El Mayo and Chapo's son. He was the one who allegedly was going to broker this meeting between them, at which Chapo's son kidnapped El Mayo. However, obviously that pleasant meeting didn't happen, and El Mayo was kidnapped, and this university rector was murdered. Now, it looks like the government of Sinaloa, and the governor of Sinaloa was also meant to be at this meeting. It looks like he faked a video of the rector being murdered, but he wasn't actually murdered where the government claimed he was. It's a complete fake. It's a kind of AI-generated fake of his murder. It's absolutely extraordinary, but baffling, Byzantine, so many different players trying to get their version of the story across.
But, okay, we know he's been murdered, of course, then, but not in the place.
We know that he has been murdered, but not where the government said he was murdered.
There's almost too much in that last intervention by yourself.
Yes, I do apologise. It's so complex.
But it's okay. But I think that perfectly defines what's going on in Mexico. We need to let's shuck the corn a bit here and pull off layer by layer and say, what was this agreement, or what was this meeting that was being brokered? Well, who was standing to gain out of this?
So I think what's quite clear and what's come out is that we've always had most academics will say, and journalists who are not in fear of being whacked will say, that there is a fairly open agreement between the authorities of Sinaloa and the drug traffickers. And the drug traffickers pay bribes. They pay large amounts of money, basically to be left on their own. At the same time, they tend to try to keep the violence down. Sinaloa has occasionally hit the kind of peaks of assassinations of places like Ciudad Juarez or Nuevo Laredo, but in general, it's relatively peaceful, given that it's the center of the drug trade. They also try to keep drug addiction down. It's very noticeable. I have a friend who's works in kind of drug rehab, and he says that drug rehab in Culiacan, in the capital of Sinaloa, no one goes there. I mean, partly because the Sinaloa Cartel doesn't really like to sell on its own patch, but also because everyone's terrified if they went there, they get whacked as a drug addict. So there is this kind of agreement between the government and the cartels. And some of these government leaders clearly work as effectively kind of brokers between different factions that have disagreements. Now, I think what, to me as a historian, what's fascinating is the rector's name was Melicio Quen. Melicio Quen's grandfather was also called Melicio Quen. Melicio Quen's grandfather turns up in the documents that I was seeing from the 1930s, basically running one of the first opium rings. Rocha, who's the governor, I think comes from the De La Rocha family. I think he's probably quite smartly changed his name. The De La Rocha family, for about 50 years, have been involved in the opium trade. Both these guys come from Badiraguato. Badiraguato is basically where most of the drug traffickers that you'll have heard about come from. It's certainly where Chapo comes from. It's where Caro Quintero comes from. It's where Fonseca comes from. It's where Amado Carrillo Fuentes' family comes from, at least. So, you know, these people are interrelated. They've known each other for generations, and there is this disagreement between them and the drug traffickers. So, you know, the fact that the rector of the university, Melicio Quen, and the governor appear to have been involved in some kind of meeting or putative meeting, a meeting that went badly wrong between Mayo and Chapo's son, is actually not that surprising. One suspects these happen quite regularly. Just they don't normally go as wrong as they did in this case.
It sounds like we're looking at, it goes far beyond corruption, more into total establishment permeation of these illicit this illicit trade.
Yeah, I've always been I'm always slightly dubious, but to use the term corruption, I'm not sure it's even terribly useful, right? Because it can both describe, you know, one single solitary policeman taking a mordida, taking a little bribe for a car, you know, maybe speeding or having a back headlight knocked out in Mexico City. But it also can describe what is de facto, as you rightly say, the imbrication of the authorities and the drug trade. Sure. And one thing that I found in my book that I thought was really fascinating is that there is some evidence, not huge amounts, but there is some documentary evidence that the money from the drug trade not only goes to the massive houses that these governors build, right, or their Cayman Islands, but some of it does also go to basically to civil society. It goes out in terms of, I mean, Sinaloa itself is relatively wealthy, and a lot of that money actually does come from the drug trade. It doesn't all just flow out.
Yeah. So it's not even I would say a parallel state. Again, the two things are entirely cross-pollinated, the legal and illegal, as you say. As well, my kind of point is that it's no longer corruption; it's de facto. It's what happens.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm not sure that I think as social scientists, I sometimes think we kind of lack the language. We tend to, you know, because we say, well, what is it? Well, state capture, but state capture is kind of private companies overtaking the state. Here, these are cartels or organized crime, whatever, drug trafficking organizations that have kind of emerged from the state gone off and done their own thing, and then attached themselves to the state again. I'm not sure that we have. I mean, I now search around in the works of criminologists to try and work out. But it's interesting how, to me, political science and criminology don't actually talk to each other very much. Really have the kind of language to describe what's going. So some people use. So this is very vague terminology. People talk about the grey area between organised crime and the state. Well, I mean, that doesn't really describes everything. There's another one. I've got this here. What's his name? Alfred McCoy, who talks about. He's got another. Sorry, I can't remember the term offhand. But there are these various terms to describe, where the authorities and the different agreements between organised crime and the state. But it's really
So if we would look back at the political situation in Mexico that leads up to this, and you've been talking about how really it's the same names, a lot of the same families, they're interrelated in these areas. But how did we get to a point like this? And I want to kind of point at Peña Nieto. I know it comes from way before this, but this kingpin list that he had, the idea that it was going to eradicate the problems by this kingpin list and the target number was largely ineffective. I would say exploded into even broader situation of turf wars, a fragmentation of those cartels, and they became more diffuse, smaller cartels. Perhaps you could give us a bit of background on that, and then leading up through AMLO, López Obrador, and of course looking at Sheinbaum.
Yeah, certainly. So there was no doubt a kind of agreement between the federal government broadly, not necessarily the president, but members of the federal government, normally through the federal police, the version of the FBI, and the drug traffickers. And it goes back, I think, probably to the 1970s. However, that seemed to break down during the early 2000s. And then a president called Felipe Calderón came to power in 2006. He only beat AMLO by about 0.5%. And it looks like he kind of launched a war on drugs to a certain extent to kind of gain credibility, having just won the election in very, very dubious circumstances, actually. So he starts this war, and you're absolutely right. It creates havoc. The murder rate goes way up. I mean, the murder rate in Mexico, unlike Colombia, was actually really low in the early 2000s and late 90s. It had a kind of murder rate similar to the US, not very far off. So it suddenly goes up. And you're absolutely right. Then a president called Peña Nieto comes in charge. He's from the old PRI party, which has controlled Mexico from 1929 to 2000. He promised to bring stability. And he appears on the front of kind of Time magazine, and he's a kind of photogenic, empty-headed photogenic. He would have been very good at a soap opera stuff, like his wife, less so as a politician. And it's saving Mexico. He's going to save Mexico. And for about a year, no doubt, murder rates do actually go down. And it does appear that his plan is basically to try and re-establish the relationship between the federal authorities and the drug traffickers, to try and dampen everything down. However, then something spectacularly basically really bad goes wrong. He captures Chapo, and then Chapo escapes. And at that point, there's an enormous pressure on him, not only to clamp down on Chapo. This is a humiliation for Mexico, particularly the United States, but also to clamp down on all other kingpins. So this is when, from about 2015 to 2018, he really goes after the kingpins. And he has this list. You're right. I think it's 122 people on the list. 110 of them are arrested or killed. I mean, it is, and it completely fragments the drug trade, as you rightly say. Partially because these larger organizations fragment, they fight between themselves. Also, because to take these people down, you've had to have informants inside these people. You've had to turn people against their former allies. So no one trusts each other anymore. So now you go from kind of in 2010s, maybe a dozen or so organized crime organizations. You're now talking maybe 20 larger ones and then 400 separate, very localized gangs, which occasionally ally with the larger ones if there's a shipment of fentanyl coming through, and occasionally fight them if they think they can make more money by nicking the stuff. So, I mean, and this, yeah, I mean, it's really, and it's also, what that also did is really spread these organizations out. They simply didn't, I mean, one thing that's really noticeable, they weren't in, for example, Quintana Roo, Cancun Coast, where you go on holiday. They weren't in Chiapas. They weren't in Oaxaca, right, where my wife comes from. They were mostly in the northwest and a bit in the northeast, and then a little bit in kind of Michoacan and Guerrero, where they grew the poppies. That was about it. Now they're everywhere.
So, I mean, this, and of course, the organized crime, when we look at this, it extends well beyond the fentanyl, the poppies, the transshipment of cocaine. It's into, obviously, like everything, it encompasses kidnapping, extortion, illegal tapping of oil pipelines. I even want to say the Totoawa fish trade. I want to say it connects everything. Everything illicit is connected.
Everything illicit and a lot licit. I mean, I think this is there's an extraordinary couple of surveys done by a group called Mexico Evalúa. And they went up to Tijuana and went to Quintana Roo and basically did surveys of extortion. And they found that everyone below the large international corporations who either have amazing amounts of private security or have probably made a deal with the government, who have links to organized crime, to not get extorted. Everyone else, kind of middle class below, gets extorted. Taco stand owners, people who own, a load of nixtamal mills or, bakeries around the town, they're all paying now. That's from Tijuana in the northwest to Quintana Roo in the southeast. So this kind of extortion, it's almost a parallel tax system and this is where we get into kind of parallel states. It's almost a kind of parallel tax system.
Sure.
So it's really extraordinary. I mean, and these people, they also, I mean, during the COVID, we saw pictures of them handing out supplies to people, just like the state should, right? So they were basically, funding this partly through a kind of broadly a taxation system. I mean, there's some extraordinary stories, which I know a mutual friend of ours, Johan Grillo, has dealt with, about if you look at the price, for example, of chickens in Mexico. How much a pound of chicken costs? Well, it's about 30% more because the cartels where the chickens are produced put 30% on the people who farm the chickens. So everyone pays now a mafia price, 30% extra on their chickens. So it is really extraordinary. It's not all the country. That has to be made very clear. Some places the authorities are more in league with the organised crime than others, but most of them have to come to some agreement.
Of course. The way of staying alive is coming to some agreement. We see this all over with organised crime. Can we point at Peña Nieto's then, that his policies were particularly damaging for Mexico at this time, or was it just a general evolution into a violence that we could have predicted?
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, people kind of look back. I teach a course on kind of the history of the drug trade, and we kind of finished with something on mass incarceration in the United States. And there are people who look back to kind of a Jim Crow era where the prison is effectively used as a substitute for slavery. And then there are people who go, no, it's Nixon who launched a crozid war on drugs. But then you weren't just the kind of Nixon actually didn't put many Americans in prison. Let's face it, heroin addicts were white and came back from Vietnam. So he actually had quite good methadone system for them. So now other people look at Reagan, and then other people look at Clinton and say, well, Clinton could have done something, but he just put away more people than Reagan, right? So, and I think that's kind of similar to Mexico. I mean, yes, Peña Nieto clearly doused the flames with a lot of petrol, but those flames were pretty high already. I mean, you could Felipe Calderón, who launched this war. You could look particularly at Carlos Salinas, who really did firm up the relationship between the federal state and the cartels. I mean, his brother Raul Salinas, who just got out of jail a couple of years ago. I mean, he was. I think I can say this on here without risk of being sued. He's a little bit litigious, but I mean, he was accused by many people of basically being in charge of taking payments from the drug cartels. And I've spoken to people who appear the DEA was tapping his phone, and they have him talking to the major drug traffickers. That's the president's brother.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. Again, with I would say this interconnected nature of the business and the way the politics has to work, and the funds, the economy that is driven by it. I'm located here in Colombia, so I'm seeing many things of a similar note that you're talking about. But if we move on from Peña Nieto and we head to AMLO, López Obrador, and I think it's best that you give us an overview of the evolution of the situation.
Right, so we haven't really, in actual fact, I was looking actually before this for some articles which gave a kind of overview of his security policy. And in actual fact, as far as I can make it, there doesn't seem to be one kind of overall article. That's my kind of call me to the New Yorker if they're listening.
Well, I'll let them know.
But I mean, so he comes to power with his kind of dicho, his saying, his motto, which was abrazos no balazos, right? Mm-hmm. Hugs, not bullets. It's like kind of David Cameron, hug a hoodie kind of era stuff. So I'm not going to kind of clamp down in this way that Peña Nieto did on the cartels, and particularly on the kind of low-level street thugs, right? They need an education, they need better wages, they need to get fed, they need better parenting, and he's quite a kind of traditional person in that way. So what he has done on that side, and I think this can't be denied, is that he has brought thousands, millions out of poverty. I think it stands at somewhere like about 3,000 people a day left poverty during the AMLO regime. It really is quite impressive. The second thing he's done is if you had a paid wage labor job, and about 50 to 60% of Mexicans don't, they work in the informal economy, as you know from Colombia. If you have a wage labor job, your salary has increased quite noticeably, right? The third thing that he's done is he's basically given pensions to old people. Now, the middle class in Mexico City don't care because, frankly, it is a pretty small amount, right? It's not very much money, but it has radically changed the life of poor people in the provinces who no longer have to worry about their crippled 65-year-old dad who's worked the fields all the time, because now he gets enough for rice and beans or tortillas and beans every week. So that is a massive change. And I think his idea is that will gradually work. And I think there is some evidence that it is gradually working. I mean, I think there is some evidence of that. If you look at kind of long-term trends of homicides, it has gone down. It reached a couple of years ago, and since then it has decreased. And it's decreased in certain areas where the economy has got better, so particularly Mexico City, where I think the homicide rate's been cut by something like 2/3. It really is. I mean, Mexico City is a very, very safe place now, safer than most US cities. Probably why it's full of US people. So there are success stories. Okay, what has gone wrong? He hasn't done the kingpin strategy at all. He's made it very, very clear that he has no interest in taking down kingpins. This was made really clear in 2019. The military capture one of Chapo's sons, a guy called Ovidio, and Ovidio's men go out into the streets. The story is they threaten to burn down the barracks with the soldiers' families in there. And as a result, AMLO takes charge and says, no, release him. We're not going to let loads of people die just for capturing some guy and giving him to the Green Guard, right? So he's really, really stood back from that. I think that there's no doubt about that, which is why this whole thing with Mayo and Chapo's son is so strange. It looks like the Mexicans were not involved. It looks like this was either Chapo's son working alone or Chapo's son working with somebody in the US administration, which is pretty dodgy if you've got US institutions kidnapping people out of Mexico. Anyway, so you've got the kingpin strategy. The third thing he's done is he's basically, and this is huge, which no one really covers as far as I can make out, again, in the United States, certainly, he got rid of the federal police. Now, the federal police was unbelievably corrupt. The head of the federal police, Genaro Garcia Luna, is in prison in New York. Maybe Mayo will join him. He took millions of dollars from the Sinaloa Cartel. Every one of his predecessors did the same. The federal police were effectively the people who regulated. They were the link between the federal authorities and the cartels, right? So he said, we'll get rid of them. They're super corrupt. And instead, we'll put the military in charge of security. As you can imagine, this is highly problematic because the military, however bad the federal police were, they did have some kind of police training. So the amount of people accused and busted for drug trafficking has gone way down because there is no federal police doing this. There's still local police, but a lot of them don't want anything to do with the drug trade. They go, it's a federal crime, so they stand back. So, I mean, the military one of the things that, again, I suspect is rather like Colombia is it's also very, very difficult to know quite what the military is doing. Outside, I mean, in Mexico City, it's there, it's in uniforms, it looks very smart. It does allegedly makes Mexicans feel safe. There's a lot of trust in the military. However, in the countryside, who knows? It looks AMLO has told them that unless things are getting totally out of control, stay in the barracks. Don't interfere. We'll try and negotiate this kind of stuff out. I mean, clearly, some of them are taking bribes still, probably at a lower rate than the federal police. But I mean, that is a very low bar.
Yeah, and this will only increase. I mean, over time, as the military settles into the positions and spaces or the vacuum left over by los federales or the federal police, the military will no doubt again fill that gap. Was it Claudia Sheinbaum as mayor of Mexico City who was also approving the militarization of the security in Mexico City?
Yes, she approved it, but she did something else. And this is where, if we're going to talk about what she's going to do, she has the whole militarization of Mexico to deal with. And I'm not sure I can read her on that. At the moment, she's going along with AMLO. I mean, she's going along with AMLO on everything. I mean, she kind of has to because she's not in power yet. Whether she can lever him from power, lever him from influence, upturn some of his biggest projects, who knows? But where I think she has differed in terms of her morality was that, yes, she allowed a degree of militarization, but the real crucial key to her security policy was she brought in a guy called Omar Garcia Harfuch, who is known as, I think he's known as like Batman. I mean, he's a super cop, right? He comes from Jalisco, it's kind of the west side of Mexico, comes into Mexico City, makes a big show of these kind of modern policing techniques where he's basically going to use data analysis to focus police in certain areas. So they really because you find out that basically most crime in a city takes present in about, I don't know, like 5% of the streets. So if you focus police there, crime actually really does go down. So he did loads of these things. There are rumors that he also basically took cartel members and organized crime members outside Mexico City, shot them in the head and stuck them in mass graves. I have no idea about that. But those are some rumors. There are also other rumors that he really messed around with the homicide figures. So a lot of people seem to there seem to be unknown causes, I think, is the highest reason for people's deaths. They seem to have shifted murder to unknown causes in a lot of the lists of the dead. So there are arguments about that. Where I find it quite difficult to believe that he is some kind of revelatory super cop is his, and going back to history here, he is the grandson of one of the military people involved in the 1968 massacre of students. in Mexico City. Perhaps more worrying, he is the son of a guy called Garcia Paniaguas, who was head of the Secret Service that worked hand in glove with the narcos to set up the first ever Mexican cartel. I mean, I think that is well established. His half brother was a fairly major trafficker who got whacked in public in 2011. So this guy, who Sheinbaum created into a kind of super cop, is now going to be head of security in Mexico.
For the whole of Mexico.
He's yeah. I suspect if he, I mean, every single head of security in Mexico over the last 30 years eventually has his comeuppance in some horrendous, embarrassing corruption scandal. I think to a certain extent, to be a good cop, you kind of have to make deals with some people, right, to get information at the very least. And I suspect he will also have his comeuppance. If not, I mean, he's incredibly popular. He's the son of a son of a spy and a beautiful actress. I mean, that's the Mexican dream, right? I mean, so I wouldn't be surprised if the guy, if he keeps his nose clean, doesn't go for president in the next.
I was going to say, it sounds like if he can manage the next few years, then surely a presidential run is on the cards.
Yeah, I always think I mean, Mexico City is so much easier to organise than the rest of the country, though.
Sure.
I think there's somewhat of an illusion that if you can manage the monster, if you can manage a city of 35 million, then you can manage the rest of the country. But that's just simply not the case. I mean, it's basically. I mean, the other thing that I think made Mexico City so good is they put in a lot of video technology. It kind of became like London, right? I mean, it's just full of video cameras everywhere. You can't do that in Guerrero.
No. So this is a fascinating situation where it looks like you've got a super cop who is immensely popular, who will be right beside Sheinbaum, because obviously one of the major issues that any Mexican president, as is their total mandate, is that of security. Before anything, I would say security. So how will we look towards November 5th and the U.S. elections and a potential Trump or a potential Harris victory? What can we see developing there? Because I think you can see that there will be a hat tip to a strong man. But from either side, I would say, either Harris, or if it's producing results, or let's say publicly permitted results, then either side would be favorable. But it could really shake up a relationship with the great neighbor to the north.
Yeah, I mean, there are different issues here, obviously. So, okay, one of the first issue is, if Trump comes to power, is he actually going to do what he says he's going to do? If he does what he says he's going to do, and he's going to basically attempt to really block migration, and also start to deport people, that not only is going to create huge social chaos in the United States, it's also going to create huge social chaos south of the border. I mean, it's really going to be absolutely terrible, and that will destabilize huge amounts of things. I mean, the key issue is that I do think that to a certain extent we get a slightly. I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that AMLO did have quite a good relationship with Trump. I think AMLO's a smart political player, and he knows how to kind of play that kind of like preening narcissist. Just pretend to be nice to him, right? I mean, pretend to be great. It doesn't seem hugely difficult, right? Especially if you and the deal he made was really simple. Was we will stop the Central American migrants, and then just leave us alone. And that really was it. I mean, there are more people in detention, and I think no one knows this in the US, more people in detention, migrants in detention in Mexico than there are in the United States. I mean, there's a huge... I mean, if you don't know what the military done, it stayed in the barracks except to catch migrants, right? And you've got these huge detention centres all through Mexico, which we don't know really what goes on in them. Again, horrible rumours, some kind of stories coming out, some NGOs who are allowed in very briefly. What was it, 39 people burnt to death in the one in Ciudad Juarez about a year ago. Bloke hasn't been prosecuted, who clearly just left them locked in right? While that happened. So effectively, Mexico. So a lot of this stuff, I think, Mexico's kind of been allowed to do what it wants, particularly in terms of security, right? If you know Mexico, I mean, occasionally the DEA is clearly really, really dislikes Sam, right? But the DEA's only thing is drugs, right? So they don't like the fact that AMLO, he was famously photographed shaking the hand of Chapo's mother. He also there's a big New York story about him. Oh no, was it ProPublica story about him allegedly his campaign taking some money in 2006? I mean, that story had been going around in DEA circles for 4 years. I mean, it's been a lot of been made of it. It's basically some middleman in his election committee probably took some money. I mean, I'd be amazed that anyone gets to president in Mexico or Colombia over the last 50 years hasn't taken some money that came from drugs, right? So I just don't think it's a really big thing. I mean, it's not good, but it's just not particularly revelatory. So clearly the DEA hates AMLO for this, but the rest of the US administration, particularly the State Department, goes, well, you're helping us with the migrant problem. And also, if you do get people out of poverty, less Mexican migrants.
So, I mean, this is it, isn't it? And we talk about it's taking the positives and almost looking the other way, because there are so many multifaceted problems that lead into so many other different issues. In your expert opinion, do you feel a Harris presidency would tackle things differently?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if many of us know, right? No. I mean, one thing that I mean, I probably would agree with Trump on is she's been pretty loose on any kind of policy, right? And also, it's something you find from being involved in British politics. A lot of in British don't believe anything any of them say, but in general, my assumption is she would basically take the Biden route, which is be rhetorically quite tough, and basically continue and the Obama route, which is be just as tough on migration. Yeah. And occasionally probably voice slightly stronger objections to things like, we can bring this up, the last thing that AMLO will do is he will introduce elections for the judiciary, for judges, right? Yeah. Clearly, the Democrats think this is anti-democratic. I suspect that Harris, who came to power, would probably, maybe the ambassador would say something this is quite a bad idea. My suspicion is that Trump wouldn't care. But I mean, I don't think they'd change things either way. I mean, it's all migrants.
Yeah, so if we took a look at this, the whole picture, we've talked about the politics. We've gone from Peña Nieto all the way up to either Trump or Harris, spanning the border and so on. How does this evolution of the actual sort of drugs trade and market fit into this? All of the different, I would say, provisions coming from China, then the preparation in Mexico, and then, of course, the porous border. How do we see it? Because what we're looking at, and as we talk and as you talk, and so knowledgeably on the subject, I just come back to this issue of, and you said 40 different groups in different areas of the country. This is a huge country. I think people forget how big Mexico is. And then, of course, the fragmentation of everything, from the different cartels, from the different families, from the different groups that are in authority, be it the military or be it the leftover, federales, whomever they may be today, different politicians and so on. I just see this fragmentation, and then, of course, money coming in from China through the production of fentanyl, and then money from it's not going to be a fun few years for Sheinbaum.
No, it could be extremely difficult. I mean, one thing I will say is that I think, rather like the crack epidemic, which basically wiped out a generation, partly to do with mass incarceration, but partly also just to do with crime involved with it, it looks like potentially, and we see in some places, fentanyl use is starting to go down. Overdoses are starting to go down. Now, I think they went down last year. I think they went down from like 100,000 to 78,000, which is still like ridiculously large amounts. But they do look on the way down, particularly. So if you look at the states, places like Virginia, where the fentanyl epidemic kind of started in kind of 2015, those places seem to have had a decline of it. So it is possible that as fentanyl use goes down, that this does kind of get off the news, and that there is some kind of adjustment there. But the other thing that I would say that maybe she does have to her advantage is her party, Morena, now runs most of the states, all the states, I think. So, I mean, this does give her a degree of control. So, yes, there are warring politicians. I mean, her party, like the old PRI, is an amalgam of different factions, but she does have some control over this. So I think that probably also will help her. One thing I'd like to bring up that I think no one is really talking about, either in Mexico or the United States, is a lot of the drugs that Mexico makes now stays in Mexico. Now, that was not the case 20 years before. 20 years before, when I first came down to Mexico, I mean, there was a bit of weeds, for tourists and elite hippies in Mexico City. But it really wasn't, the most popular drug in Mexico at that point was paint thinner, right? I mean, really rough stuff. Now, there are more people in rehab for meth than there are for marijuana. I mean, meth has really taken off, and things like fentanyl has really taken off, particularly on the northern border. There's a really interesting mayor of Mexicali, which is right on the California border, and he was going, people seem to be dying here. We don't really know why. So he made the autopsy people do tests on all the dead people and found out that 20% had lethal levels of fentanyl in their blood.
So Mexico is a consumer country, then? I mean, rather than a transshipment country.
Yeah, not dissimilar to Brazil. I mean, we now know, doesn't it? Is Brazil the highest per capita use of cocaine? Britain is number 2.
You saw that, I mean, totally anecdotally on the side when they dissected the sharks in the bay of Niterói and Copacabana. They found them to have traces of cocaine because of all the urine that's been emptied into the bay by the users. I mean, so I would have always suspected that Mexico had a drug use, custom issue, but I would not have expected it to have been a properly, you could consider a consumer country. So this is something that will have to be addressed in this administration.
Yes, it will. I mean, there have been some really interesting pilot projects that are being used all over the country, and when you get down to the kind of local level, there's some really extraordinary stuff being done. As I say, I've got a couple of friends who work in the kind of drug rehab business with the health department, also with the OAS, which has done some really interesting pilot projects. But these are, as I say, they're pilots, they're isolated, and I mean, there are some also very. I mean, it also looks that. I mean, again, this is one of the wonderful mixed up things about Latin America. A lot of the cartels actually run the kind of low-level rehab centers, basically to get their gunmen off the drug. Right? You don't want gunmen running around addicted to meth.
Honestly, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised in the slightest at that. But we have to finish up here, Ben, and I want to ask you this final sort of, top line question at the end is, do you have any predictions then for the next few years regarding Mexico's security and the drugs trade?
Keep an eye on Garcia Harfuch, the head of security. I think his role will be extremely interesting. I do wonder if he is going to be used as a stalking horse for her to recreate some kind of new federal police and try to take that role over from the military. Because I don't think you can present yourself as a stable democracy with your military running your federal cops. I'm trying to think of places where that happens, and you need some kind of federal policing authority. So that's going to, I can see that happening in the future. That will be a kind of change. And also, I suppose, keep an eye out for Mexico being the next Brazil in terms of a kind of drug addiction crisis. That's a very depressing prediction, particularly if they start to deport people back.
Yeah, definitely. But it does make perfect sense if based on obviously your research and the data available. It does make perfect sense. And if you're talking to people on the ground in pilot projects, well, they are there. There's nothing like boots on the ground to give you the real picture.
Well,
Well,
you also talk about you talk to the people who run the small gangs, and they have no links to. They can't get the drugs out. They have no one. They might have a cousin in like New York, but they can't get the stuff through Tijuana.
mm,
So they're just going to flog it on the street in their tiny town in Hidalgo.
yeah, that makes sense. It makes total sense. It's an unfortunate and depressing comment to finish on, but we have covered some. There are positives in here in this last 40 minutes. There
Yeah,
are
yeah.
positives. And let me just say, well, thank you so much for your time. We really have been privy to a fantastic conversation about a lot of the great complexities of what Mexico and President Sheinbaum have to face, and of course, how they got to this place right now. And of course, we'll be watching for further developments in the El Mayo, Los Chapitos. In this friction, let's say, this conflict between the two. I've been speaking to Benjamin Smith, the professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick, also the author of The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. It has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, Richard. That was a delight. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I've been talking to Benjamin Smith as well. This is the LatinNews Podcast based out of Bogota here. I've been your host, Richard McCall. Be sure to tune in again in a fortnight's time where we'll be talking about more issues from the region of Latin America. Thank you again, and goodbye.